She knocked on a stranger's door at 11 o'clock at night with mascara running down her face and a voice that kept breaking every time she tried to say she was fine. She was a billionaire. She ran a company with 400 employees. She had been on the cover of 3 financial magazines in the last 2 years alone. And she was standing in a hallway crying because a man she'd met for dinner told her she should be grateful anyone showed up at all. This is the story of what happened after that knock, and why the person who opened that door would change everything she thought she knew about being seen. If this story already has you feeling something, hit that like button and drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain had been falling since mid-afternoon, the kind of slow, indifferent rain that doesn't come down hard enough to be dramatic but won't stop long enough to be ignored. It just kept coming, thin and gray and relentless, turning the sidewalks dark and filling the gutters with a thin brown current that moved nowhere in particular. Grayson Hale noticed it the way he noticed most things, briefly, practically, without sentiment. He checked the window above the kitchen sink, saw the wet glass, and turned back to the cutting board where a sweet potato sat waiting to be diced. The exhaust fan above the stove hummed. The small television on the counter was playing a nature documentary with the volume low enough that he couldn't make out the words. Just a British voice saying something steady and calm about migration patterns. He liked that. The background noise. The apartment was too quiet without it. Across the narrow hallway that divided the 6th floor of the Caldwell building into its 2 units, he could hear almost nothing. That was how it usually was. His neighbor, Vivian Sterling, the name on the mailbox, a name he'd read maybe twice and never thought much about, kept irregular hours. Sometimes her lights were still on past midnight. Sometimes her door opened at 6:30 in the morning and he'd hear the precise click of heels on tile before the elevator arrived. They had exchanged maybe 20 words total in the 9 months since he'd moved in. A nod, a held door. One brief conversation about a package left in the wrong mailbox. She was cordial, composed. The kind of person who existed at a frequency slightly above the one Grayson operated on. He didn't take it personally. He was sweeping sweet potato peels into the trash when he heard the elevator doors open. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the sound that followed. Not heels, but something slower, uneven, shoes that weren't quite making contact with the floor the way they should. Grayson didn't think anything of it. He turned the burner to medium and reached for the olive oil. Then he heard it. A sound he couldn't identify at first, something between a breath and a word, stopped short before it could become either. Then quiet. Then the sound again, and this time he recognized it for what it was. Someone was crying, trying not to, but crying anyway. He set the oil down. He stood still for a moment, which was his version of deliberation. Then he walked to his front door and opened it. Vivian Sterling was standing in front of her own door with her key in her hand and her head bowed forward, and she was shaking. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself. Just this quiet, private shaking that she was very clearly trying to contain with everything she had. Shoulders drawn in, jaw tight, one hand pressed flat against the door like the door was keeping her upright. Her coat was wet at the shoulders. The careful arrangement of her hair, which was deep brown and normally precise, had come apart somewhere, pieces of it loose around her face, damp at the ends. Her mascara had tracked 2 distinct lines down each cheek and dried there. She didn't hear him open the door right away. She had the key near the lock but wasn't quite inserting it, just standing. Then she turned. The expression that crossed her face when she saw him was something Grayson filed away without meaning to. The very fast sequence of embarrassment, and the effort to shut the embarrassment down, and then just exhaustion. She was too tired to perform anything more than that. "Sorry," she said. Her voice was still intact, but barely. I wasn't trying to." She stopped, tried again. "I'm fine." Grayson looked at her for a second. "You don't have to be," he said. That was it. That was the whole thing he said. And something about the flatness of it. No pity in it, no performance of concern, just a plain statement of fact, made her press her lips together very hard and look away. "Do you want to come in?" he asked. "I'm making food. You don't have to talk." She looked at him. A long look. The kind that's actually a calculation. She was weighing something he couldn't see. "I don't want to impose," she said. "You're not." A Another long pause. The rain made a sound against the window at the end of the hall. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay." His apartment was smaller than hers. She could tell that immediately, not because it was cramped, but because it was arranged with the specific efficiency of someone who'd made peace with limited square footage a long time ago. A secondhand couch with a quilt folded over the back, a bookshelf that was half books and half stacked junk, a flashlight, some tools, what looked like a small science kit for kids, a drawing on the refrigerator held up by a magnet shaped like a watermelon, a pair of tiny sneakers by the door. She looked at the sneakers. "My daughter," Grayson said without her asking. "She's with my mom tonight." He pulled out a chair at the small kitchen table. "Sit down." Vivian sat. She put her bag on the floor and her hands in her lap and looked at the tabletop. Her nails were painted a deep burgundy. One of them had chipped sometime during the evening, and she hadn't noticed until now. Grayson moved around the kitchen without asking anything. He turned the sweet potato down to low, filled a kettle, put it on the back burner. He set 2 mugs on the counter, both mismatched. One white with a faded blue logo from some 10K race, one yellow with a small chip on the rim. He dropped a tea bag in each without ceremony. Vivian watched all of this. There was something about watching someone just do ordinary things, the click of a kettle lid, the soft clink of mugs, that made the tight thing in her chest loosen slightly. She hadn't expected that. "You don't have to stay in the kitchen," she said. "I know." He didn't move. He was stirring something in the pan. "You don't have to talk yet either." She let out a breath. It came out more ragged than she intended. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a second and looked at the ceiling. "I went on a date tonight," she said finally. Not because she'd decided to tell him, just because the words came out. Grayson didn't say anything. He turned the heat down slightly. "A blind date? Set up by someone from work. She meant well." Vivian's voice had gone flat in the way that happens when you're narrating something you've already half detached from. "He was fine at first. Fine. We ordered drinks. He asked about my work and I told him, and he seemed impressed, or he performed being impressed. And then somewhere around the second drink, he started talking about—" She stopped. The kettle started to murmur. "He spent most of the dinner talking about weight loss," she said. "His ideas about it. The science of it. He kept saying things like, 'Not that I'm saying anything,' which is what people say when they're absolutely saying something. And at one point he actually said—" She stopped again, her jaw shifted. "He said I had a lot going for me and that I should use this time in my life to really invest in myself, like I hadn't already." She laughed, but it had no warmth in it. "And then when I got up to leave, he grabbed my hand and said I was being too sensitive and that he was just being honest because he thought I was worth it." Grayson turned from the stove. He brought both mugs over and set hers in front of her without asking if she took anything in it. She looked at the mug. "The worst part," she said, "is that I sat there for almost 45 minutes. I let him finish his salmon. I nodded and said, in the right places. Because I've spent my whole career learning how to stay in rooms where people are saying things that they'd never say to someone they thought was equal to them, and I just—" She exhaled. "I just did what I always do. I managed it." Grayson sat down across from her and wrapped both hands around his own mug. "That sounds exhausting," he said. "Not I'm so sorry. Not he was wrong, you're beautiful. Not anything that would require her to deflect or reassure or perform gratitude. Just, that sounds exhausting." "It is," she said, and for some reason, that was when her eyes filled. She pressed her fingers against them quickly, annoyed with herself. "You don't have to do that here," he said. "Do what?" "Hold it together." She lowered her hand. She looked at him directly for the first time since she'd sat down, really looked, the way you look at someone when you're deciding whether to trust them. He looked back without flinching. He had the kind of face that didn't offer a lot. Brown eyes, a jaw that hadn't been shaved in a couple of days, a small scar near his left eyebrow from what looked like an old injury. He wasn't performing anything. He was just there. She cried then. Not sobbing. Not the kind of crying that takes over a room. Just a quiet, honest kind of crying. The kind she'd been pushing back for 2 hours. She covered her face with one hand and let herself do it for about a minute, and he didn't say a word and didn't move closer and didn't pat her shoulder and didn't try to fix anything. He just drank his tea and waited. When it was over, she took a shaky breath and sat up straight and reached into her bag for a tissue. She wiped her face, looked at the ruined mascara on the tissue. "Sorry," she said automatically. "Stop apologizing." "Right." She crumpled the tissue. "Right. Are you hungry?" She blinked. "What?" "I made too much. Sweet potato and black bean. It's not fancy, but it's food." Vivian looked at him. She hadn't eaten anything. She'd been so nervous before the date that she'd barely touched her food, and then spent the back half of dinner not touching her food for entirely different reasons. "Yeah," she said, "I'm hungry." His name was Grayson Hale, and he was 32 years old, and he fixed HVAC systems for a living: heating, ventilation, air conditioning, which meant that on any given workday, he was crawling into attic spaces or descending into basement utility rooms, or standing on commercial rooftops in weather that made the commute unpleasant. He had calluses on his palms and a work van he'd been meaning to get detailed for months, and a daughter named Sylvie who was 8 years old and deeply interested in bugs. He'd moved to the Caldwell building because it was close to Sylvie's school and the rent was reasonable and the super didn't chase him about anything. He'd lived there 9 months, and in that time had painted Sylvie's small bedroom a shade of blue she'd selected herself from the hardware store. "Not light blue, Dad. That's a baby color. I want the one that looks like the ocean at night." And had successfully argued with the super about a faulty window latch in the living room and had learned exactly which floorboard near the bathroom would wake Sylvie up if he stepped on it after midnight. His life was arranged around her in the way that single parents arrange everything. Her schedule was the axis: her school pickups and doctor appointments and the weekly ritual of Sunday pancakes, which she presided over with the seriousness of someone running a test kitchen. When she was with him, the apartment was loud and complicated and alive in ways he hadn't anticipated when she was born. When she was at his mother's or her friend Priya's house for a sleepover, it went very quiet. He'd gotten used to the quiet, but getting used to something and liking it weren't the same thing. He thought about that sometimes after Sylvie was asleep and the apartment had gone still, and he was doing whatever small maintenance task he'd been putting off: tightening a screw in a cabinet hinge, cleaning the filter on the range hood. The quiet was fine. It was manageable. His life was manageable in a way that had taken 3 years to construct after Sylvie's mother left, and he wasn't looking to dismantle any of it. He wasn't, he'd told his mother when she brought it up the 3rd time last spring, lonely. He was just focused. She had looked at him the way only mothers look at their adult children when they are saying something technically true but fundamentally misleading, and she had said, "Mm-hmm, honey," and changed the subject. Vivian Sterling was 30 years old and ran a financial technology company called Verdant Capital that processed somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 billion in small business transactions every year and had 412 employees across 3 offices. She'd founded it at 24 with $80,000 she'd borrowed from 2 credit cards and a private investor who told her she was too young, and she'd come back and proved him wrong within 18 months. She was, by any metric that the business press used to evaluate such things, successful. She had 3 profile articles behind her, 2 of which had included some version of the phrase "rising star in fintech," and one of which had focused heavily on the fact that she was a plus-size woman in an industry that wasn't exactly known for its body diversity. That one she'd read once, and then put away and hadn't gone back to, because even the flattering parts managed to make her feel like a novelty. She had learned over years of boardrooms and pitch meetings and industry dinners how to carry herself in a way that moved attention immediately to her intelligence, her numbers, her track record. She dressed well and spoke precisely and never arrived underprepared. She had built, over time, a kind of professional armor that was both genuine and exhausting to maintain. What she had not managed to build in all that time was the other thing, the private thing, the ordinary thing that people talked about at parties as if it were simple. Someone who just loves you, you know? She dated. She had tried periodically and with diminishing enthusiasm the apps and the setups and the industry events where you were supposed to be networking, but everyone was also, at some level, looking. It always went the same way. Either the person was interested in her money and company profile and didn't actually see her as a person at all, or they were attracted to her in the abstract but had opinions about her body that eventually surfaced, diplomatically at first, and then less so. She had started to wonder, in the private part of her mind where she kept things she didn't say out loud, whether she was asking too much, whether the combination she wanted, someone who found her genuinely attractive, someone who wasn't interested in her bank account, someone who could sit in a room with her and not make her feel like a problem to be managed, was just statistically unlikely. Tonight had not helped with that. They ate at his small kitchen table, which only had 2 chairs and not much room between them and the wall. The sweet potato and black bean was simple and warm, and she ate all of it, which she hadn't expected. "Do you cook like this every night?" she asked. "When I have the energy? When I don't, it's cereal or scrambled eggs." He considered this. Sylvie went through a phase where the only thing she'd eat for dinner was buttered noodles. Not pasta. Noodles specifically. I don't know what the difference is to her, but there's definitely a difference. How old is she? 8. She'll be 9 in March. He pushed a piece of sweet potato around his plate. She's going through a bug phase right now, like a serious one. She has a notebook where she draws every bug she finds and writes its name underneath. Some of them she looks up. Some of them she just names herself. Vivian almost smiled. What kinds of names? Depends on the bug. There's a beetle she found in the park that she named Gerald. There's a millipede that lives in the gap under the radiator that she calls Dr. Noodle. He paused. I've tried to relocate Dr. Noodle several times. He always comes back. She sounds like a handful. She's the best person I know. He said it without any sentimentality, just as a plain fact. She's also absolutely feral in the morning and refuses to eat eggs unless they're scrambled a specific way that I still haven't fully figured out. Vivian set her fork down. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the drawing on the refrigerator. A child's crayon rendering of what might be a dog or might be a horse, surrounded by what were definitely flowers. Does she know her mom? She asked. She said it carefully, not sure if she was crossing a line. She knows her, Grayson said. They have a relationship. He exhaled. It's fine. Her mom and I didn't work, but she tries with Sylvie when she's in town. Which isn't always, but he shrugged. We figured out a version of it that doesn't mess Sylvie up too much. So far? So far, Vivian repeated. Parenting is basically just hoping you're not doing lasting damage and adjusting as you go. That's bleak. It's realistic. But he was almost smiling now. She seems okay. She's got friends. She does well in school. She has opinions about bugs. Those seem like good signs. Yeah, Vivian said. Those do. Yeah. She stayed until almost midnight. They moved from the kitchen table to the couch at some point. Not deliberately, but in the way that you drift when a conversation has gone on long enough that you stop monitoring it. He told her about a job that week at a restaurant downtown where the owner had been convinced there was something wrong with the HVAC system when actually someone on staff had accidentally blocked an air return with a stack of crates. She told him about a board meeting last month that had gone sideways because 2 of her investors had a personal history. She'd only found out about 20 minutes before they were all supposed to be in the same room. They didn't talk about the date. He didn't ask her to elaborate on it, and she didn't go back to it. It stayed where she'd left it. Said, acknowledged, set aside. At 10:50, she looked at her phone and saw the time and felt something she hadn't expected, a small reluctance to leave. The apartment was warm. The conversation had been easy in a way that conversation was almost never easy for her. She stood up and gathered her bag and coat. Thank you, she said, for the food, and for not... She paused, trying to figure out how to say the thing accurately. For not saying anything ridiculous. He looked at her. Like what? Like... She made a vague gesture. The usual things. He was an idiot. You're beautiful. You don't need him. All of that. Those things are all true, he said. But they're not really the point, are they? She looked at him for a moment. No, she said. They're not. She walked to the door. He came with her, which was the polite thing to do, and she stepped into the hallway, which was still and bright with the fluorescent light above the elevator. Grayson, she said. Yeah. I knocked on your door because I didn't want to be alone. I want you to know I don't usually do that. I know, he said. I mean, I don't know how you know that, but... She shook her head slightly. Thank you. She turned toward her own door. He watched her for a second. If Sylvie catches you in the hall sometime, she's going to ask you about bugs, he said. Just so you're prepared. Vivian turned back. Something in her face had shifted. Not a full smile, but close. The closest thing to it she'd managed all night. I'll try to have thoughts ready, she said. She went inside. He heard the lock turn. He stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at nothing. Then he went back into his apartment and finished the dishes and turned off the television and went to bed. And for reasons he didn't bother to examine, the quiet felt slightly less quiet than it usually did. The week after that, Tuesday passed normally, or nearly so. Grayson picked Sylvie up from school on Wednesday, listened to a 12-minute unprompted lecture about carpenter ants that she'd apparently researched during free period, made pasta for dinner, helped with reading homework, and put her to bed at 8:30. He had 2 jobs Thursday, a commercial boiler inspection in the morning and a residential call in the afternoon for a family whose thermostat had stopped communicating with their system. Standard. He spent Friday filing paperwork he'd been avoiding. He didn't think much about his neighbor. He noticed, in the abstract way you notice things you're not monitoring, that her door opened on Thursday morning at the usual time, that the lights in her apartment went on around 7 in the evening. Normal patterns. On Saturday afternoon, Sylvie on his couch watching a documentary about deep-sea creatures, he heard a knock at his door. Vivian Sterling was standing in the hall in a flannel shirt and jeans with her hair in a loose ponytail and a cardboard container of what turned out to be 2 cups of coffee and a paper bag with the logo from the bakery down the street. She looked, he noticed, like a completely different person than she had on Tuesday. Less composed, but more real. She held the coffee and the bag out toward him. I owe you, she said. I don't know what I owe you exactly, so I went with pastries, which seemed like a safe bet. It is, he said. He opened the door wider. You don't have to let me in, she said quickly. I can just... Vivian. He stepped back. Come in. She came in. And Sylvie, who had the particular supernatural awareness of 8-year-olds when something interesting was happening, was already off the couch and standing in the hallway with her socks pushed down around her ankles. She stared at Vivian with enormous seriousness. Who are you? She asked. Sylvie, Grayson said. What? I'm just asking. I'm Vivian, Vivian said. I live across the hall. Sylvie appeared to weigh this. Are you my dad's friend? I think so, maybe. Do you know anything about bugs? Vivian glanced at Grayson. He was looking at the ceiling. I know that bees are technically wasps, she said, and that some beetles can survive being eaten. Sylvie's eyes went wide. What? They have armored shells. Some birds eat them and they just survive the whole thing. Go right through. Sylvie turned to Grayson with the expression of someone who has just received life-changing information. Dad, did you know that? Eat your Saturday, he said. Let her sit down. That. The coffee was better than anything he had at home, and the pastries were a specific kind, those flat, slightly crispy almond ones he'd liked since he was a kid. And Vivian sat at his kitchen table while Sylvie described Dr. Noodle in extensive detail and showed her 3 separate pages of the bug notebook, and Vivian listened with what appeared to be genuine interest, asking questions that made Sylvie progressively more animated. Grayson drank his coffee and watched. He wasn't sure what he'd expected her to be like outside the context of Tuesday night. Something more buttoned up, maybe. More distant. But she sat with one knee pulled up on the chair and laughed at the right moments, and told Sylvie that Gerald the Beetle was clearly a name with dignity and weight, which is important for a beetle. And Sylvie said, That's what I thought too, in a tone that suggested she'd just found a kindred spirit. After Sylvie went back to her documentary, Vivian wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and looked at Grayson. She's spectacular, she said. I know. She's also going to know more about invertebrates than most entomologists by the time she's 12. I genuinely think that's possible. He finished his coffee. How's your week been? Busy? Good busy. She paused. I had a board meeting Thursday that I actually went into calm, which is unusual. I don't know why. She looked at him sideways. Maybe I slept better. He didn't say anything, but he understood what she was telling him. They sat for a while longer. Not long, maybe another 20 minutes. And then she stood and said she had work to do, which was always, she said, true on weekends. He walked her to the door. Sylvie called out, "Bye, bug lady," from the couch without looking up from the television. Vivienne's expression when she heard that was something Grayson registered and set aside. A quick, unguarded pleasure, there and gone. The kind of expression you have when something surprises you by making you happy. "Bye, Sylvie," she called back. She turned toward her apartment, stopped. "Same time next week," she said. "I'll get the coffee again." He leaned against the doorframe. "You don't have to keep paying me back." "I know I don't have to." She pulled out her keys. "Same time?" He looked at her for a second. "Sure," he said. "Same time." She nodded once, like an agreement had been formalized, and went inside. He shut his door and stood in the small entryway for a moment. Sylvie's voice drifted in from the living room. "Dad, did you know that dragonflies have been on Earth for 300 million years?" "I did not know that." "They're older than dinosaurs." "That's wild." "I think I want to be a dragonfly scientist." "What happened to beetle scientist?" "I can be both." He went back to the kitchen and stood at the window for a minute, watching the rain that had started up again, lighter than Tuesday, more forgiving, and thought about the fact that when he'd opened his door 4 nights ago, he hadn't known anything about the woman across the hall except her name on a mailbox. He still didn't know that much, but he knew she listened to his daughter with her whole face, and that she took her coffee black, and that she laughed in a way that she seemed slightly surprised by, as if it caught her off guard. He thought that was probably a start. Outside, across the city, the rain kept falling, over the bakery where she'd bought the pastries, over the restaurant where a man who did not deserve her time was probably ordering dinner with someone else, over the school where his daughter drew bugs in her notebook with the seriousness of a scientist, over this building and this hallway and these 2 apartments that shared a wall, and now something smaller and harder to name. The rain fell and the city moved, and somewhere in the ordinary noise of a Saturday afternoon, without anyone deciding it, something had begun. The Saturday coffee became a thing without either of them deciding it would. The following week, Vivienne showed up at the same time with the same cardboard carrier and a different pastry. Something with pears and brown sugar that Sylvie declared too fancy and then ate entirely. The week after that, Grayson had the coffee already made when she knocked, and she stood in his doorway for a second looking at the 2 mugs on the counter with an expression he couldn't quite read before she came inside. It wasn't a ritual exactly, it didn't have rules. Some Saturdays Sylvie was there and some she wasn't, and the texture of the visit changed accordingly, louder and more chaotic when Sylvie was home, quieter and longer when she wasn't. Vivienne would sit at his kitchen table or on one end of the couch, and they'd talk about whatever was on top of the week. A difficult client, a bad commute, something funny that had happened at Sylvie's school. The conversations moved the way good conversations do, without agenda, pulling in directions neither of them planned. He didn't think too hard about what it was. It was Saturday coffee. That was enough of a name for it. What he did notice over the course of those weeks was the way she loosened. It happened slowly, and he might have missed it if he hadn't been paying attention in the background way he paid attention to most things. The first few Saturdays, she still had something slightly managed about her. The same precision she probably carried into boardrooms. An invisible quality of being prepared. Then one morning, she arrived with wet hair because she hadn't dried it yet, and a smear of what turned out to be yogurt on the sleeve of her sweatshirt, and she sat down at his table and said, "Don't look at my sleeve," without any embarrassment, and he thought, there she is. There's the actual person. He didn't say that. He poured the coffee and asked about her week. But he filed it away, that version of her, the unstyled, unpolished Saturday morning version. He found that one easier to be around, somehow, than the composed woman who'd existed on the other side of his door for 9 months before any of this started. The dinners started because of a Tuesday. He'd come home late from a job. A nightmare of a commercial install that had run 4 hours over because the contractor on site had roughed in the ductwork wrong and nobody caught it until Grayson was already elbow-deep in the plenum space. He got back to the building at 7:45 with dirty hands and a headache and the specific depleted feeling of a long day doing physical work in a tight space. Sylvie was at his mother's for the week, school break, and the apartment was dim when he unlocked it. He stood in the kitchen looking at the refrigerator, and the refrigerator didn't offer anything useful in return. He was considering whether eggs counted as a real dinner when his phone buzzed. "I made way too much soup. Do you want some?" A pause. Then, "I'm across the hall." He looked at his phone for a second. "Yeah," he typed back. "Give me 10 minutes to change." He showered the job off him in 7, pulled on clean clothes, and knocked on her door for the first time. She opened it, and for a moment he registered her apartment the way he'd registered his own when he first moved in. The way a space tells you something about a person before they say anything. It was larger than his, the way he'd figured, and more open. A lot of glass. Bookshelves along one whole wall, organized, a wide couch in a dark green. A kitchen island where a pot sat on the stove and the whole room smelled like something with tomatoes and herbs. It was also, despite all of that, slightly cold. Not in temperature, just in the way that a space feels when someone lives in it alone and has never quite claimed it as home. "You look terrible," she said, not unkindly. "Long day." "Sit down. I'll get bowls." The soup was good. Not precious good. Not something that was trying to be impressive. Just real and warm with crusty bread she'd picked up somewhere and a jar of Parmesan on the side that she slid toward him without asking. They ate at her kitchen island because her dining table had 3 open laptops and a stack of folders on it that she'd clearly been working through before he arrived. "Do you always work at the table?" he asked. "I always work," she said. "The table is just where it ends up." "What time do you stop?" She looked at him. "Why?" "Just asking." She broke off a piece of bread. "Late. It depends. There's always something. There's always an email that needs to go out, or a call with the West Coast team, or a deck I should have finished 3 days ago." She paused. "I'm not complaining. I built this. She stopped. "Just what?" She turned the bread over in her fingers. "I don't know how to turn it off. I've been doing this since I was 24, and I don't really have an off switch. Which is probably why—" She stopped again. He waited. "Which is probably why my personal life looks the way it does," she finished, without self-pity. Just flat, like a fact she'd accepted. Grayson set his spoon down. "How does it look?" She gave him a dry look. "You found me crying in a hallway. That was one night." It wasn't a fluke. She pushed the Parmesan toward him even though his bowl was still half full. A redirect. "I've been focused on building the company for 6 years. And that was the right call. I believe in that. But it means I'm 30 years old and I don't have—" She made a vague gesture toward the table with the laptops and the folders and the accumulated evidence of a life that was very full in certain directions and very empty in others. "Friends?" he said. "I have people at work I like. It's not the same." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She looked at him. "What about you? What about me? You do the single dad version of what I do with work. You're very focused on Sylvie, which is admirable, but you also seem like someone who hasn't let anyone in a while." He was quiet for a moment. He wasn't offended. It was accurate. "My ex leaving kind of recalibrated what I thought I was building," he said. "I thought I was building one thing, and I was actually building something different. And then when she left, I had to figure out what the different thing was and how to make it work." He looked at his bowl. "Sylvie needed stability, so I built stability, and I got used to it." "Stability and isolation aren't the same thing," Vivian said. "I know that." "Do you?" He looked at her. She was watching him with the same quality of attention she gave his daughter when Sylvie explained bugs. Not waiting to respond, actually listening. "Maybe I've let them blur a little," he said. She nodded slowly. Then she stood and took his bowl and refilled it without asking. Mom. After that, dinner wasn't planned either. It just happened. Sometimes at his place, sometimes hers, sometimes with Sylvie there, and sometimes not. It fell into the rhythm of their weeks with no announcement. Vivian would text him something brief. "I got groceries. I'm making something. Interested?" Or he'd knock on her door with leftover chili or the occasional batch of the cornbread his mother had taught him to make from scratch. They didn't make reservations or pick restaurants. They cooked, or one of them cooked, and the other sat on a stool at the kitchen island and talked or read or sat with their phone, and the arrangement had an ease about it that he found himself counting on without noticing when he'd started. Sylvie adapted to Vivian's presence the way children adapt to things that make intuitive sense to them. Immediately, completely, and with very little fuss. She had her own designated spot at Vivian's kitchen island, the stool closest to the window, and she'd started leaving small things there without thinking about it. A library book, her bug notebook, once a half-eaten granola bar that Vivian found Monday morning and texted him a photo of with the caption, "She left a thing." He'd responded, "I'll tell her." A minute later, "Don't. It's fine. The stool needed something on it." He looked at that text for longer than he should have. What he was learning about her piece by piece was that Vivian Sterling was not who most people thought she was. The public-facing version, the CEO, the fintech wunderkind, the woman in the magazine profiles, was real. That intelligence was real. That drive was real. The precision of her thinking was real. But the thing people missed, because it was underneath all of that, and she'd learned very young to cover it with competence, was that she was also someone who still flinched when someone laughed too loud at the wrong moment, who had a specific anxiety about being the last to arrive anywhere because it meant walking into a room where people were already seated and looking up, who kept her apartment so clean partly out of genuine preference and partly because it was one of the few things she could control completely. She told him some of these things. Others he figured out. The telling happened in the gradual way that real telling happens, not in one conversation but across many, a detail here and a detail there, a thing said and then moved past and then returned to weeks later from a different angle. She told him about her mother, who had put her on her first diet at 11. Not viciously, her mother wasn't a vicious person, just with the particular casualness of someone who assumed that a daughter's body was something to be managed and optimized. She told him about a job interview at 22, before she'd started Verdant, where the panel of interviewers had been fine and professional right up until the end, when one of them made a comment about presentation that had nothing to do with her slides. She told him about a relationship at 27 that ended because the man she was with, who had seemed kind and thoughtful for 7 months, had eventually let her know, gently and with apparent good intentions, that he'd been hoping she would take better care of herself while they were together. She said all of these things in the same flat, reported tone she used when she was talking about business. Not detached, he could feel the weight underneath it, but controlled. Like she'd learned that presenting it as data instead of wound made it easier to say. What he gave her, in return, was the thing she seemed to need most. He did not react to any of it as if it were a problem to solve. He listened. He asked questions that were about her rather than about the situation. He didn't say things like, "You should have," or "I would have," or "How did that make you feel?" in the therapeutic tone that signaled someone was managing you rather than just talking to you. He just received it. That was the whole thing. He just let her say it and received it and let it be true. She had, he understood, spent a lot of her life not being received. Well, there was an evening in early November, a weeknight, Sylvie at a friend's house for dinner. Vivian had texted that she had wine and cheese and approximately zero desire to cook, and was he interested? He was. He came over and she'd spread everything on the coffee table, so 3 kinds of cheese, crackers, sliced apple, olives. She admitted she'd bought because they looked good, and then remembered she didn't really like, and they sat on her large dark green couch with the television on at low volume, some documentary about architecture neither of them was fully watching. At some point, the conversation had moved from work to the past to something quieter and more honest. The kind of territory you can get to after weeks of small conversations have worn down the formal parts. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "When your ex left," she paused, "was it because of Sylvie? Or was it something else?" He looked at his glass. "Bit of both," he said. "She didn't want the life we had. I thought she did, but she wanted a different version. Travel, flexibility, no fixed schedule. And I was working a union job and we had a 3-year-old and I wasn't going anywhere." He turned the glass slowly. "I think she also wanted someone with more ambition is the wrong word. Trajectory, maybe. Someone going somewhere specific. And I was just someone doing what he did. There's nothing wrong with that." "I know, but I understand why it wasn't enough for her." He said it without resentment, which was a thing she noticed. "We weren't right. We should have figured that out before we had Sylvie, but we didn't, and now Sylvie exists, so..." He spread his hands. "Net positive. Vivian looked at him. You're remarkably unbitter about it. Being bitter about it doesn't help, Sylvie. That's the practical answer. The other answer is that I was sad for a long time and then I stopped being sad and I don't miss it. I miss the idea of it sometimes, the original idea, before it became what it became, but not the actual thing. He looked at her. What about you? The guy at the gala. What gala? Whenever it is. The charity thing your assistant mentioned when you were on the phone last week. He registered her expression. Your voice carries. I need thicker walls. She pulled her legs up onto the couch and wrapped her hands around her wine glass. There's a gala next month. My company is a sponsor. I have to go. And Mitchell Crane will probably be there because he's always at these things. She said the name the way you say a name you've said many times in your head, without introduction, as if he'd know it. He didn't. Who's that? She looked at him. The man from the blind date. He went very still. He runs in the same circles as your investors? He runs in every circle. She took a sip of wine. He's for money. Old money. The kind where you don't have to be good at anything because the money exists regardless. She said it without venom, just description. He goes to these events because people like him always go to these events. Are you worried about seeing him? She thought about it honestly. I'm not worried, she said finally. I'm annoyed. There's a difference. I know how to be in a room with someone I don't like. I've been doing that professionally for years. She paused. I just don't want it to... She stopped. Don't want it to what? She looked at him sideways. Don't want it to mess with how I've been feeling lately. She said it quietly, carefully, like she was placing something fragile on a table. He understood what she meant. He understood it precisely. He didn't make a thing of it. Then it won't, he said. You don't know that. No. But you walked out of that restaurant before he could take anything real from you. You've been the one deciding what this fall looks like. He looked at her directly. He doesn't get to change that retroactively. She was quiet for a moment. The documentary on the television showed a building being demolished in slow motion, walls folding inward, a cloud of dust rising, all of it unhurried and almost beautiful. You're better at this than you act like, she said. At what? Saying things. She tilted her head, saying the right thing. You act like you're not a talker, but you're actually very precise when it matters. He picked up a cracker. Don't tell anyone. I have a reputation for being concise. She laughed. The real one. The one that still surprised her. The one that she didn't curate. So, Sylvie's contribution to all of this was, as Sylvie's contributions tended to be, blunt and accidental and exactly right. It was a Saturday in mid-November, the three of them walking back from the farmer's market 4 blocks away. Sylvie carrying a paper bag of apples she'd selected herself based on a rating system she'd invented involving color, firmness, and what she called the STEM situation. Grayson had the rest of the groceries. Vivian had, at Sylvie's insistence, been given the bag of cheese because Sylvie had decided that Vivian looked like a cheese person, which Vivian had found inexplicably touching. They were almost back to the building when Sylvie stopped in front of the small tree that stood near the entrance, its leaves mostly gone, but a few dry brown ones still holding on. Vivian, Sylvie said. Yeah? Do you like being around us? Grayson looked at the sky briefly. Sylvie? I'm just asking. You don't have to come with us to the market. You could have said no. Vivian crouched down slightly. Not all the way to Sylvie's level, just part way, the way adults do when they want to be taken seriously by a child. I like it a lot, she said. Is that okay? Sylvie appeared to consider the question in full. Yeah, she said. Because I like you, and my dad smiles more when you're around. She said this with the complete neutrality of someone reporting a weather pattern. He used to not smile as much. Grayson looked at a point somewhere past the tree. Vivian straightened up. She glanced at him sideways. He was not looking at her, which told her something. That's good to know, she said. Sylvie picked up her bag of apples and headed for the door. The STEM situation on the Fuji ones was really excellent today, she said, already moving on. Lisette. Vivian stood beside Grayson for a second in front of the entrance. Your daughter, she said, is 8 years old and apparently knows more about what's going on than either of us. He held the door open. She's been like this since she could talk. They went inside. The lobby was warm after the cold air outside, and the elevator was slow as always, and they stood in it with the groceries and the cheese and the apples and the comfortable silence that had, without either of them formally agreeing to it, become its own kind of language. At the 6th floor, they went to his apartment because it was closer, and he had the larger cutting board. Sylvie went immediately to the living room to examine the apple she'd declared the prototype of her new rating system. Vivienne set the cheese on the counter and stood there for a moment, looking at the drawing on the refrigerator, the crayon dog horse, and the flowers that had been there since the first night she sat at this table. It was a simple thing to notice, but she noticed it. She noticed that she knew which drawer he kept the good knives in and which burner ran hot, and that the cabinet above the stove had a slightly sticky hinge you had to lift before pulling. She knew the bug notebook was kept on the second shelf of Sylvie's bookshelf, and that the blanket on the couch was from Grayson's mother, and that he always left one mug on the counter overnight instead of putting it away. She knew the shape of this apartment, the way you know the shape of somewhere you've returned to many times. That, she thought, as she reached past him for the cutting board, was not nothing. She didn't say it. It wasn't time to say it, and she wasn't sure yet what it was, and naming something too soon was a reliable way to make it fragile. But it wasn't nothing. She was sure of that much. Outside, the November sky had gone pale and flat, the early dark of the season settling over the city like something it did without thinking. Inside, the cutting board came out, and the apples went into a bowl, and Sylvie announced her ratings from the living room, and Grayson turned on the kitchen light, and somewhere in all of that ordinary noise, the truth of what was happening continued to grow, quietly, stubbornly, the way the real things always do. The charity gala was held at the Meridian, a hotel downtown that had been renovated twice in the last decade and still couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Old money or new money, grand or modern, the kind of place that tried to split the difference and ended up being neither entirely. The ballroom on the 4th floor had high ceilings and chandeliers that someone had spent real money on, and round tables covered in white linen that all looked exactly the same. Vivienne had been to this specific event 3 years running. She knew the layout. She knew which side of the room the bar was on and which corner had the worst acoustics and which of the sponsorship tables put you closest to the exit. She had selected her dress 2 weeks earlier, deep burgundy, structured at the shoulder, the kind of dress that did not ask to be noticed but got noticed anyway, and she had arrived on time, which for her meant 7 minutes early, and she had gone immediately to find her company's table and say hello to the board members who were already seated. She was fine. She was composed. She was good at this. What she had not factored in was that Mitchell Crane would be standing at the bar when she walked past it at 8:15 and that he would see her before she saw him. Vivienne. She stopped, turned. He looked the same. That was the aggravating thing about people like Mitchell Crane. They always looked the same, comfortably assembled in a dark suit that had been made for him specifically, hair that cooperated without effort. He was smiling with the particular warmth of someone who believed that his smile was an adequate apology for most things. "I was hoping you'd be here," he said. She looked at him for exactly as long as it took to decide how to handle this. "Mitchell," she said, neutral, unrevealing. "You look really wonderful." His eyes moved over her in the way she'd learned to recognize. Not quite rude, not quite acceptable. The assessment happening behind the compliment. "I've thought about reaching out. I wasn't sure if—" "You don't need to," she said. "It's fine. I wanted to apologize. That night, I was out of line." He had the delivery of someone who had rehearsed this, which meant he'd thought about it, which meant some part of him understood he'd done something worth thinking about. "I said things I shouldn't have. I'd like the chance to—" "Mitchell?" She kept her voice even. "I appreciate you saying that, but there's nothing to revisit." He paused. The smile hadn't entirely left, but it had adjusted. "Are you sure? Because I think we had something worth—" "I'm sure." She held his gaze. "Enjoy the evening." She turned and walked back toward her table, and she did not look back, which she was proud of, and her hands were entirely steady, which she was also proud of. And when she sat down next to her CFO and he asked if she wanted another drink, she said yes, please, a glass of the red. She was fine. She texted Grayson from under the table, which was childish, but she did it anyway. He's here. 3 minutes later, her phone buzzed. I know, you're fine. She looked at the screen. You can't possibly know that. You walked past him and didn't set anything on fire. By your standards, that's fine. She pressed her lips together to keep from smiling in the middle of someone's welcome remarks. How do you know I didn't set anything on fire? She typed. Wild guess. She put her phone away. The smile stayed for a while without her permission. What she didn't tell Grayson that night, when she got home and knocked on his door because the apartment felt too quiet and he opened it without surprise, was what happened at 9:45. She'd been talking to one of her investors, a woman named Carla Fitch, who ran a mid-sized venture fund and had been with Verdant since the second round, when she saw Mitchell across the room. He was talking to a man she recognized as one of her board members, Thomas Hale. Not related to Grayson, different Hales, common name. But Thomas was old guard, traditional, the kind of board member who asked about optics more than he asked about numbers. She watched them for about 30 seconds, long enough to see Thomas glance in her direction twice during whatever Mitchell was saying. She didn't know what was being said. She couldn't know. And she told herself it was probably nothing. Mitchell at a party, talking to people, that was what people like Mitchell did. But the thing settled somewhere in the back of her mind and stayed there. She didn't mention it to Grayson because she didn't want to say it out loud until she understood it better, and because part of her thought she might be reading something into nothing, and because the evening had already taken enough of her energy and she just wanted to sit on his couch and decompress. Which she did. He made tea. She sat with her shoes off and her feet tucked under her, and she talked about the welcome remarks and the terrible silent auction items and the way one of her VPs had given a toast that went 4 minutes too long. And Grayson listened and occasionally said something dry and accurate, and by 11 o'clock the back of her mind had gotten quieter. She drove back to it later, alone in her own apartment, replayed the image. Thomas's eyes flicking toward her, Mitchell's easy posture, the comfortable fluency of two people who know each other well enough not to have to work at a conversation. She filed it away. She'd been building a company for 6 years. She knew the difference between a thing you could ignore and a thing that would eventually require your attention. December came and Sylvie's school had a winter concert that Grayson mentioned offhandedly on a Wednesday. He said it without intention. They were in the hallway, both heading to their respective days, and he said, she's got her concert Thursday, the one she's been worried about because she has 2 lines to say, and she keeps delivering them like she's reading a tax document. Vivian stopped walking toward the elevator. 2 lines? She's a lamppost in the play. Lampposts apparently have speaking roles this year. Can I come? He looked at her. He hadn't asked. He'd mentioned it because it was on his mind, not because he was extending an invitation. You don't have to, he said. I know I don't have to. Can I come? He studied her for a second. There was something in her face that he recognized. The particular directness she got when she wanted something and had already decided to be straightforward about it rather than approach it sideways. Yeah, he said. Of course. I want to see the lamppost deliver her lines. She's been practicing in front of the bathroom mirror. Even better. She came Thursday. She sat beside him in the 3rd row of the school auditorium. The seats were the fold-down kind that creaked when you shifted, and she didn't take her coat off because the auditorium was cold in the way that school auditoriums are always cold. Some fundamental institutional failure of heating that has probably existed since school auditoriums were invented. She watched the whole thing with her hands folded in her lap, and when Sylvie's 2 lines came, delivered in a careful, overly deliberate voice that was Sylvie's version of professional composure, a voice that was very obviously the same as her father's, Vivian made a small sound beside him. He looked over. She had one hand pressed to her mouth, and she was very clearly trying not to make more noise than was appropriate. She sounds exactly like you, she whispered. She does not, he whispered back. She absolutely does. That's your face. That's your voice. He looked at the stage where Sylvie had resumed her lamppost posture with great seriousness. Yeah, he said quietly, she does. After, in the crowded hallway outside the auditorium, Sylvie found them immediately and went to Vivian first, which Grayson noticed without making anything of it. Did you see me? Sylvie demanded. I saw you. You were incredible. My second line was a little fast. It was perfectly timed. My teacher said the same thing, but I think she was being nice. Sylvie considered this. Were you being nice? Sylvie, Grayson said, I'm asking because Vivian usually tells me the true thing. Vivian crouched down to her level. Your second line was a little fast, she said, but you owned it. Nobody in that audience knew it was a little fast except you. Sylvie nodded slowly. That's what I thought. She stood up. I'm going to find Priya. She was a tree and I need to debrief. She disappeared into the crowd with the authority of someone who knew exactly where she was going. Grayson and Vivian stood in the hallway for a moment, the noise of other families moving around them. She trusts you, he said. I know. Vivian sounded slightly awed by it. She handed me that like it was nothing. For her, it is nothing. When she trusts someone, He made a gesture. She just does it. She's like that. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Must be nice, she said, to trust like that. He looked at her. She was watching Sylvie cross the hallway, and her expression had that quality he'd seen before, the one where something true was close to the surface, but she hadn't decided yet whether to let it come up. He didn't push it. He never pushed it. Come on, he said. She'll want pizza after this. She always wants pizza. The thing at work started quietly, the way trouble usually starts. It was Thomas who brought it up at the December board meeting. Not directly. Thomas never said anything directly, which was either a boardroom skill or a character flaw. Vivian had never fully decided which. He waited until the main agenda was finished, until the financials and the projections and the Q4 summary had all been reviewed and approved, and then he set his pen down and said, There's something I'd like to raise, informally. The room had 8 people in it. 4 board members, Vivian, her CFO Marcus, her chief of staff Dana, and their outside counsel who only came to certain meetings, and this wasn't supposed to be one of them. Vivian looked at Thomas. Go ahead. There's been some conversation, he said, in the careful way of someone who is choosing not to name the people having the conversation, about optics, specifically about public-facing associations and how they might read to institutional investors, given that we're in a pre-Series D environment and people are watching. The room was very quiet. I'm not sure what you're referring to, Vivian said. She said it flatly, which meant she was entirely sure. There are photos, Thomas said, from the farmer's market, a couple of the fall events. Your neighbor. He paused. There's been some question about whether the relationship, whatever it is, could be perceived as Thomas. Her voice had gone to a specific register that Marcus recognized and Dana recognized, and which meant be very careful. What exactly is the question? He cleared his throat. The question is whether a personal connection with someone who isn't, he searched for the word, professionally aligned to Verdant's brand creates any perception issues we should be getting ahead of. The room waited. Vivian set her own pen down very deliberately. She looked at Thomas without hurry. She'd been in enough rooms where people said impossible things while expecting her to manage their discomfort about saying them. And she'd learned a long time ago that the first instinct, the one that wanted to make it easier for everyone, to smooth it over and move on, was almost always the wrong one. What you're describing, she said, is a concern that I'm spending personal time with a working-class man and that this reflects poorly on the company. Thomas opened his mouth. That's the thing, she continued. That's the actual thing underneath the language you just used. I want us to be clear about what we're discussing. The silence that followed had several different textures in it. Dana was very still. Marcus was looking at his notebook. The 2 other board members, both newer, both younger than Thomas, were looking at the table. I'm raising it because it's being raised, Thomas said. I'm not saying I personally. Who's raising it? A pause. I'm not in a position to... Thomas. She let that sit for a moment. I'm going to be direct with you. The person I choose to spend time with is not a board agenda item. It is not an optics consideration. It is not something that requires a conversation in this room. And if someone in my investor network has concerns about my private life rather than my Q4 numbers, which were strong, I'd like them to bring those concerns to me directly rather than through intermediaries. She picked her pen back up. Is there anything else on the agenda? Another silence. Thomas looked at his hands. No, he said. That's everything. Good. She looked around the table. Thank you all. Marcus, can you stay a minute? The room emptied. Marcus stayed. When the door had closed behind the last person, he looked at her. You okay? I'm fine. I know what it was. She stood and went to the window. The city below was doing its December thing. Gray light, early dark, people in coats moving fast. Mitchell Crane was talking to Thomas at the gala. Marcus didn't say anything, but his expression did something. I saw them, she said. I didn't know what they were talking about. Now I have a theory. She turned from the window. I need you to quietly find out which investors Thomas is in contact with outside of board communication. I want to know who's in whose ear. Viv, professionally, I'm not going paranoid. I just want to know what I'm working with. Marcus looked at her for a moment. He's not going to stop, he said. Crane, he came back because you didn't react how he expected. People like that, when someone doesn't behave the way they anticipated, they don't just leave it alone. I know. He's going to try to make this a story. I know that too. She gathered her things. Which means I need to make sure there's no story to tell. The numbers are good. The company is solid. My personal life is my personal life. She looked at Marcus. He only has power if I act like he has power. Marcus nodded slowly. Set up a call with Carla Fitch for this week, she said. If anyone in the investor group is going to tell me the truth about what's circulating, it's her, Schatz. She didn't tell Grayson about the board meeting. She thought about it. Several times in the days after, she got close to bringing it up. During one of their kitchen conversations on a Saturday when Sylvie was at a friend's and the apartment was quiet and the moment felt right. But she always pulled back from it at the last second. Part of it was practical. She was still gathering information. She didn't like bringing Grayson a problem she didn't have the shape of yet, because his instinct would be to carry it, and she didn't want him carrying something that might turn out to be manageable. Part of it was something less practical and harder to say. She had spent a long time building walls around the private version of herself, the version that existed outside the company, outside the professional success, outside the CEO identity. And Grayson had gotten through those walls, slowly and without pressure, just by being consistent and present and honest. What they had in the hallway and the kitchen and the farmer's market and the school auditorium was something she didn't have language for yet, but recognized as rare. She didn't want the ugliness of Mitchell Crane's behavior to touch it. She didn't want Grayson to know, yet, that someone was looking at what they had and trying to find a way to make it into a problem. The irony was that she'd spent years defending herself in rooms full of people who underestimated her, and she was very good at it. But she wanted this one thing, this particular unnameable thing, to stay out of that fight for as long as possible. She was aware, in the analytical part of her mind that never fully switched off, that this was probably not a sustainable strategy. Mercier, Carla Fitch called her back on a Thursday afternoon, and Vivian took the call walking around her apartment because she always thought better when she was moving. I'm going to be straight with you, Carla said, which was what Carla always said before she was straight with you. There's some noise, not from me, not from the main investor group, but there are two angels from the first round who've been restless, for reasons I can't fully trace. Mitchell Crane, Vivian said. A pause. I don't have his name on anything. But he's been at the last 3 industry dinners that I've also been at, and he's very interested in talking about Verdant. He frames it as admiration. He asks about your next raise timeline. He asks about board composition. Carla paused again. He also asks, and I'm telling you this because you need to know, about you, personally, in a way that sounds like concern and isn't. Vivian stopped walking. She stood in the middle of her living room. What does he say? He says he's worried about you, that you seem... Carla's voice had a careful quality, not her natural register. Distracted, that there are some personal decisions he's observed that make him wonder if you're in the right headspace for another raise. The room was very quiet. He doesn't name names, Carla continued, but he references the situation a couple of times. Whatever that means. Vivian understood exactly what that meant. She sat down on the edge of her couch. Carla, she said, what do the angels think? They think he's probably right. These are people who've known him for 15 years and known you for 3. That's the math. And you? I think he's a man who went on 1 date with you and can't process being irrelevant to you. Carla's voice returned to its normal frequency, direct, slightly impatient. I also think he's smart enough to work the room effectively. And I think you need to get ahead of this before the Series D conversation starts. Vivian set her hand flat on her knee and pressed it there. What do you recommend? I recommend you stop letting him control the narrative by being the only one talking. After she hung up, she sat in the quiet apartment for a long time. The city sounds came through the window. A siren somewhere, traffic, a delivery truck's idle. The lights were on across the hall. She could see the thin line of yellow under Grayson's door, which she could see from the peephole if she looked. She thought about the lamppost play, the farmer's market and the Fuji apples, the quilt on the couch, the way Sylvie left her granola bar on the stool closest to the window, like it was a place that belonged to her. She thought about the board meeting, about Thomas's careful language and the thing underneath it. She thought about Mitchell Crane at a series of industry dinners, building something small and corrosive out of the thing she'd told no one mattered, and had come, without realizing it, to rely on completely. She stood up. She put on her coat, which she'd dropped on the chair by the door, and she went into the hallway and knocked. Grayson opened the door. He took one look at her face. "Come in," he said. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Okay." He stepped back. She came inside. She stood in the middle of his kitchen under the same light that had been on the night she first sat at this table 4 months ago, and she told him about the board meeting. She told him about Carla's call. She told him about Mitchell Crane at the industry dinners, building a quiet case out of the ordinary details of a life she'd been living right here in this building, on this floor, in the specific warmth of these 2 apartments. When she was done, Grayson was leaning against the kitchen counter with his arms crossed. He'd listened the whole way through without interrupting. His jaw had shifted once when she'd gotten to the part about Mitchell's exact phrasing, the situation, her headspace. But that was all. "How long have you known this?" he said. "The board meeting was 2 weeks ago." He looked at her steadily. "Why didn't you tell me before?" She met his eyes. "Because I didn't want it to touch this," she said. "Whatever this is. I didn't want it in here." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a siren somewhere below rose and fell and faded. "Vivian," he said, "I know. I don't need you to protect me from it. I know that too." She exhaled. "I wasn't protecting you. I was protecting—" She looked around the kitchen, the mismatched mugs, the drawing on the refrigerator, the small sneakers by the door. "This," she said, "I was trying to protect this." Grayson looked at her for a long moment. Then he unfolded his arms and pulled out the chair at the kitchen table, the one she'd sat in the first night, the chair that had in some unspoken way become her chair, and he set it facing outward. "Sit down," he said. "I'll make coffee, and then we'll figure out what comes next." She sat. The familiar kitchen settled around her, the sound of the kettle, the specific click of the cabinet hinge, the warm yellow light. All the things she hadn't known 4 months ago that she now knew by feel. She sat in her chair at his table and she let him make the coffee, and for the first time in 2 weeks, the tight thing in her chest loosened just enough to breathe. The coffee that night lasted until nearly 1 in the morning. They didn't come up with a plan exactly. Vivian wasn't the kind of person who made plans without full information, and she still didn't have full information. What she had was the shape of the problem. Mitchell Crane working a room, Thomas as the access point. 2 angels from the first round who'd known Mitchell longer than they'd known her. It wasn't a crisis yet. It was a condition that could become a crisis if she didn't manage it correctly. What Grayson gave her, sitting across that kitchen table past midnight, wasn't strategy. He asked questions that helped her think, not the performative kind, not questions that were really just opinions in disguise, but actual questions that opened things up. What does Thomas actually want here? Is he Mitchell's person, or is he someone Mitchell found an opening with? And you said the 2 angels have been restless. Restless since when? Before or after the gala? And What does Carla's involvement tell you about where the real line is? He wasn't trying to solve it for her. He was thinking with her. There was a difference, and she felt it. Around midnight, she said, "You're good at this." At what? Asking questions? At not making it about you. She turned her mug slowly on the table. Most people, when you bring them a problem, they start making it about how they're going to fix it. It becomes their thing. She looked at him. You just stay in it with me. He considered that. Seems like what you needed. It is. She paused. It's also not nothing. Most people don't know how to do that. He didn't say anything. He looked at the table, then back at her. Grayson, she said, yeah. I should have told you sooner. About the board meeting, about all of it. She said it flat, without the softening that would have made it easier to deflect. I told myself I was protecting something, but I was also, I think I was afraid if I told you it would change things between us. Because suddenly there's all this outside noise about what we are and what it looks like, and I didn't want to have to define it, because defining it might, she stopped. Might what? Might make it breakable. The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere below them, the building made a sound. Pipes, the old structure settling, and then went quiet again. It was already real, he said, before you named it. Naming it doesn't make it more fragile. She looked at him. How are you sure? I'm not. He held her gaze. But I know that not naming it definitely didn't protect it. Mitchell Crane is running a campaign against something he doesn't understand and can't touch. The question isn't whether what we have is fragile. It's whether you trust it enough to let it be known. She was quiet for a long moment. I trust it, she said. Okay. He stood, took her mug, and put it in the sink. Then let's go from there. None. The week between that conversation and the Verdant annual investor reception was one of the stranger weeks of Vivian's professional life, which was saying something given that she'd once navigated a potential data breach on the same day as a Series B pitch meeting. She had calls with Carla Fitch on Monday and Wednesday. She had Marcus quietly map the communication pattern between Thomas and the two restless angels, Ellison and Park, both early-stage investors who'd backed her when she was 24, and nobody, and who had apparently begun taking Mitchell's concern more seriously than she'd realized. She had a one-on-one with Thomas on Tuesday that she approached with her best professional neutrality, the kind that was so thorough it functioned as a message in itself. I know what you did, and I'm choosing to treat it as an error rather than a betrayal, for now. Thomas had been careful. He'd said the right things. He'd presented himself as someone who'd raised a question in good faith and was fully supportive of wherever she wanted to take the company. She'd let him. She'd need him functional for the reception. The annual investor reception was not a gala. It was smaller, 40 people, no press on the formal list, a private dining room at a restaurant called Grayford that Verdant had been using for this event for 3 years. It was the kind of event where real things got said because it was supposed to be informal, which meant it was where real things could go wrong. Dana sent her the guest list 4 days before. She went through it twice. Mitchell Crane's name wasn't on it, which meant either he hadn't been invited or he'd declined. It was Dana who told her, the morning of the reception, that he'd been added to Ellison's +1 slot. Vivian read the email, set her phone down, picked it up again, and called Grayson. He's coming tonight, she said. To your event? As a guest of one of my first-round investors. A pause. That's not an accident. No. She was standing at her kitchen island with her second coffee, still in the oversized shirt she'd slept in, looking at nothing in particular. He's not going to do anything dramatic. He's too smart for that. He's just going to be there. He's going to be charming and present and subtly make the case by existing in that room that his opinion of me matters. Then you need to make the case that it doesn't. I know. Not defensively, Grayson said. You can't go defensive. The second you're defensive, you've handed him the frame. She pulled at a loose thread on her sleeve. I know how to handle a room, Grayson. I know you do. You don't have to talk me through it. A brief pause. Okay, he said. Sorry. She exhaled. No, She stopped. I'm sorry. do that. When I'm stressed, I get sharp. I noticed. And you're still here? Yes. Something in his voice shifted, went quieter. Let me know how it goes. I'll be up. She held the phone for a second after the call ended. Then she put it down and went to get dressed. The reception started at 7. By 7:45, the room had the particular density of a professional gathering that was going well on the surface. Good food, an open bar, the comfortable sound of people networking without trying too hard. Vivian moved through it the way she always moved through these events, present with each person she talked to, fully there for the 3 minutes of each conversation, then smoothly on to the next. She'd been doing this for years. She was very good at it. She saw Mitchell at 8:10. He was with Ellison near the far end of the room, both of them holding drinks, and when he saw her, he raised his glass slightly. Not a toast, just an acknowledgement, telling her he was there without making it a thing. She nodded once and turned back to the conversation she was having with one of her VPs. For the next 40 minutes, she did what she did. She worked the room. She talked to Park about the Q4 numbers and the projections for the following year, and Park asked sharp questions because Park was actually a good investor, even if he'd been susceptible to Mitchell's narrative. And she answered every question with the precision and confidence that had built this company from a desk and a borrowed $80,000. She talked to 2 new potential investors who'd come as Thomas's guests. Legitimate guests, she'd checked. And she was warm and direct and answered their questions about the platform with the specific enthusiasm that was real, because she actually loved this company. She'd bled for it, and that was always visible when she talked about it. At 8:55, Mitchell materialized beside her. She'd felt him working his way across the room for the last 10 minutes. She'd clocked it in her peripheral awareness the way you track the movement of something that requires monitoring. Vivian. He had his easy smile, his practiced warmth. Your team has done an incredible job with this. The room feels... Mitchell. She turned to face him fully. I didn't expect to see you tonight. Ellison was kind enough to bring me. He tilted his head. I hope that's all right. It's a free country. She took a small sip of her water. She'd switched to water at 8 because she wanted her head completely clear. I've been hearing great things about the Q4 results, he said. The company looks really healthy. It is. She looked at him. Is that what you've been telling people? That it looks healthy? The smile adjusted fractionally. Of course, I'm a fan of what you've built. Are you? It wasn't quite a question. Always have been. He looked around the room, then back at her. The gesture was designed to be casual and was, in fact, calculated. I've been worried about you, honestly. I hope things have been... Mitchell. She kept her voice even. I want to be direct with you about something, because I think we both know what's been happening in the last few weeks, and I don't think either of us benefits from pretending we don't. He looked at her. Something behind his easy expression recalibrated. You've been in rooms with my investors, she said, expressing concern. About me personally. About decisions I've made that you've framed as distractions. She paused. I'd like you to stop. I'm not finished. She said it quietly. Not loudly. She was very aware of the room around her and the distance to the nearest cluster of people. What I do with my personal life is not relevant to Verdant's performance. And Verdant's performance is the only thing you are actually in a position to have an informed opinion about. You're not an investor here. You're not on the board. You have no operational relationship with this company. She looked at him steadily. What you have is access to some of the people I work with, which you've used in a specific way. I'm asking you to stop using it that way. He stared at her for a moment. Then the smile came back. Smaller, different. Vivian, I think you're reading something into... I'm not. She tilted her head. And you know I'm not. He was quiet. I also want to say something else, she continued, since we're being direct. She kept her voice level, kept her face composed, though the steadiness cost her something. What you said to me on that date, the comments about my body, the implication that I should be grateful for your attention, I want you to know that those things didn't land the way you probably expected. I didn't go home and decide to fix myself. I didn't spend the months since trying to be more of what you suggested. She looked at him clearly. I went home and I knocked on my neighbor's door, and I had tea and I went to bed. And the months since then have been some of the best of the last several years. She paused. I wanted you to know that. Not to be cruel, just to be accurate. The silence between them was about 3 seconds long. In the context of a busy room, it was nothing. It felt longer. I see, he said. His voice had gone flat. I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening, she said. And she turned, with complete composure, back toward the room. Her hands were shaking slightly when she reached the bar. She set them flat on the surface for a second and breathed. You okay? Dana appeared beside her with the intuition of someone who'd been working with her for 4 years and knew how to read the signs. Fine. She lifted her hands. They'd stopped. Get me a sparkling water. That was... Dana started. Don't. Right. She took the water and stood with her back to the wall for exactly 2 minutes. She counted. And then she went back into the room. She talked to Ellison. Not about Mitchell, not about any of it. She talked to him about the company, about the next 18 months, about the infrastructure they were building to handle the transaction volume increase. She watched his expression shift over the course of the conversation from the slightly guarded quality he'd had all evening back toward the engaged, forward-leaning interest that was his actual posture when he was thinking clearly. He was a good investor when he was thinking clearly. He'd made 15 good decisions with his money before someone had put doubt in his ear. By the time she moved on, she thought she'd gotten him back. Not all the way, but far enough. Grayson was awake when she texted at 10:45. She was in the elevator on the way up. It went okay. By the time she got to the 6th floor, he was already in the hallway, door open, in the jeans and old Henley he'd clearly been wearing all evening. She came off the elevator and walked toward him, and he looked at her face and said, What happened? I told him to stop, she said. Directly. In the room. He went still. How direct? Very. She stopped in front of him. She was tired in the specific way of having spent 5 hours being completely composed. I told him I knew what he'd been doing. I told him to stop. I told him the last few months of my life have been good despite everything he was trying to suggest. She looked at Grayson. I referenced you, not by name, but he knew. Grayson's expression was difficult to read. How did he take it? He went quiet, which for someone like Mitchell is about as close to conceding as you'll ever get. She exhaled. I don't know if it's over. He might regroup. He might try something else. But he knows I'm not going to manage around him. He knows I'm going to meet it directly. She paused. And he knows I'm not ashamed of anything. Grayson looked at her for a moment, then he stepped back from the doorway. Come in. I'm exhausted. I know. Come in anyway. She came in. She dropped her coat on the hook by the door and her bag on the floor, and she sat on his couch and he sat on the other end, and the television was on low. The same nature documentary channel, different episode, something about rivers this time. They didn't talk much after that. The evening had used most of the words she had. She sat with her feet tucked under her and her head tipped back against the couch, and she let the quiet work on her. At some point, Sylvie's bedroom door opened. She'd been at Grayson's for 2 nights since his mother had dropped her off that morning. And she appeared in the hallway in her pajamas, with her hair doing something complicated on one side. She looked at Vivian. You're here late, she said, with zero judgment. I had a long day, Vivian said. Sylvie considered this. Do you want some of my blanket? She was holding the blanket from her bed, trailing one end of it on the floor. Vivian looked at the blanket. Yeah, she said. Actually, yeah. Sylvie came over and draped approximately 2/3 of the blanket over Vivian's lap in an arrangement that made no geometric sense but was warm. Then she looked at her dad. I had a dream about a river, she said. We're watching a river documentary, Grayson said. Sylvie looked at the television with the expression of someone who found this deeply unsurprising. Can I sit with you for a little while? It's late, Syl. I know. She looked at him. Just a little while. He moved over. She wedged herself between them, between Vivian and her father, on the middle cushion that was slightly lower than the other two, and pulled the blanket up over her knees and stared at the river on the screen. In 3 minutes, she was asleep. Her weight had shifted sideways into Vivian without her noticing. her head finding the softest available surface, which was Vivienne's shoulder. Vivienne went very still. She looked at the top of Sylvie's head, the complicated hair, the slight weight of her, and something in her face did a complicated private thing that would have been hard to name. She looked at Grayson over Sylvie's head. He was already looking at her. Neither of them said anything. The river on the screen moved through a landscape that was enormous and unhurried, and the room was warm, and Sylvie breathed with the complete abandon of a child who was somewhere safe enough to sleep without thinking about it. Vivienne looked at all of it. The mismatched mugs on the counter, the drawing on the refrigerator, the small sneakers by the door, the man across the couch who had opened his door on a rainy Tuesday night for a stranger and given her tea and asked nothing of her, and had, without either of them intending it, become the center of something she hadn't known she was missing. She thought about what she'd said to Mitchell Crane that evening. The last few months have been some of the best of the last several years. It was true. She'd meant it as a fact, as a counter-argument, as evidence of something she didn't need him to validate. But sitting here now, with Sylvie's weight on her shoulder and Grayson's eyes on her face, and the whole unremarkable, irreplaceable warmth of this apartment around her, she understood it not as an argument but as a truth she'd been living inside for months without quite seeing it from the outside. She belonged here, in this apartment, on this couch, with these people. That was the thing she'd been protecting since the beginning. That was the thing Mitchell Crane had tried to turn into a liability, and that she'd stood up in a room full of people and refused to apologize for. It wasn't a liability. It was the best thing in her life. Grayson reached across Sylvie, and very carefully, so as not to wake her, tucked the edge of the blanket that had slipped down back over Vivienne's arm. His hand stayed there for a second. Just a second. His fingers over her hand on the edge of the blanket, warm and still. Then he moved back and looked at the river on the screen, and they sat there in the quiet while his daughter slept between them, and the city did its city thing outside the windows, and neither of them said the thing they were both, by now, very clearly thinking. They didn't need to. Not yet. But it was there, settled and sure and no longer the least bit fragile, waiting for the moment when one of them was ready to say it out loud. Sylvie woke up on this couch at 6:15 the next morning with blanket creases on her cheek and absolutely no memory of having fallen asleep there, which she found deeply interesting and reported to both of them over breakfast, as if it were a scientific phenomenon worth documenting. Vivienne had gone back to her own apartment around 1. She'd woken when Grayson had carefully extracted Sylvie from between them and carried her to bed, and in the dim light of the living room they'd said goodnight in the quiet way of people who have something unfinished between them and are, for now, okay with that. She'd slept better than she had in weeks. She noticed that. She filed it under things she was no longer pretending not to notice. In the morning, Grayson texted, "She's asking if you want pancakes. It's Sunday." She looked at the text from her kitchen while her coffee brewed. Outside, the city was doing its reluctant January thing. Pale light, cold that meant business, the kind of morning that made staying inside feel like a reasonable life choice. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, she typed back. She says bring the good syrup if you have it. She's 8 years old and she has opinions about syrup. She has opinions about everything. The syrup thing started last spring. I don't want to talk about it." Vivienne laughed in her empty apartment. She grabbed the syrup from the cabinet, the real kind, the dark amber bottles she'd bought on a whim 2 months ago and kept because Sylvie had once declared the cheap kind scientifically inferior, and crossed the hall. The pancakes were not elegant. Sylvie was in charge of the batter, which she took seriously, and the first 2 off the pan were slightly uneven, and one of them had a suspicious dark edge that Sylvie examined and declared character, not a mistake. They ate at the small kitchen table with the Sunday light coming through the window, the 3 of them passing the syrup around, and Sylvie talked about the river documentary she'd apparently half-watched in her sleep, which had given her questions about salmon that she'd already written in the bug notebook, even though salmon were not bugs. "I'm going to need a second notebook," she told them. "For fish," Grayson said. "For everything that isn't bugs but is interesting." She poured an amount of syrup that made Grayson open his mouth and then close it again. "I was thinking I could call it the Not Bug Book." "That's a very good title," Vivienne said. "I thought so." Sylvie ate a large bite of pancake. "Vivienne, do you know anything about salmon?" "I know they swim upstream to lay eggs, against the current." "Their whole lives, and then they do that one hard thing at the end," Sylvie said, with the gravity of someone who'd already looked this up. That's kind of sad. Or it means the hard thing at the end was worth it, Vivian said. Sylvie thought about that. Both can be true, she decided. Grayson looked at Vivian over Sylvie's head. She caught the look and held it for a second, and then they both looked away, back at their plates, back at the ordinary Sunday morning that was, in its complete ordinariness, about as close to perfect as either of them had been in years. The Verdant annual report went public in the third week of January, and it was by every measurable standard strong. Stronger than the year before, which had itself been strong. The Q4 numbers held. The transaction volume was up 23%. The platform's small business retention rate was the highest it had ever been, which was the number Vivian was actually most proud of, because it wasn't a growth metric. It was a trust metric, and trust was harder to build than volume. She sent the report to the full investor group at 7 on a Tuesday morning, and by noon she had responses from everyone who mattered. Carla called. Ellison emailed. A real email, not a brief acknowledgement, an actual email about the retention numbers and what they signaled about platform stickiness. Park sent a message through Marcus that was, Marcus reported, enthusiastic, which from Park means it's probably the best thing he's seen all quarter. She sat in her office after the last call and looked out the window at the January city and felt something she recognized as relief, though it was the kind of relief that had been earned rather than given. Marcus knocked on her open door. Thomas wants to know if you have time for a call this week. Sure. She looked at her calendar. Thursday morning. Marcus didn't move. She looked up. He sent a note, Marcus said, separately, before the report went out. He set a printed email on her desk, which was an old-fashioned thing he did only when something required physical attention rather than a screen. I didn't want to put it in the morning stack. She picked it up. It was short. Thomas wasn't a writer. He communicated in the compressed language of someone who'd spent 40 years on boards. It said, I want to acknowledge that I handled the December situation poorly. I allowed outside opinion to influence a conversation that was inappropriate to have in that room. That was an error in judgment. I hope the Thursday call can be a reset. He'd signed it with his full name, which he never did in email, and which meant he'd thought about the letter and wanted it to carry weight. She read it twice, set it down. Tell him Thursday works, she said. Marcus nodded. And Crane? She thought about it. I haven't heard anything since the reception. Neither have I. Marcus leaned against the doorframe. Carla mentioned he's been quieter at the industry dinners, less conversational. She looked at the city. There was a version of this where she felt triumphant, where what she'd done at the reception felt like a victory. She didn't quite feel that. What she felt was more like the quiet after a storm that's been building for a long time. Not elated, just clear, like visibility had been restored. Good, she said. She picked up her pen and went back to work. What happened next didn't happen all at once. That was the thing about the real version of any story. The resolution rarely arrives in a single moment, neatly packaged. It comes in pieces, accumulated, the way a year accumulates. One ordinary day stacked on another until one morning you look up and realize the shape of your life has changed. February arrived. Grayson got a contract that was the largest he'd taken on independently. A mid-rise building downtown, a full HVAC overhaul that would run 6 months and required him to bring in 2 other technicians. He told her about it at her kitchen island on a Wednesday night, and she could hear under the matter-of-fact delivery how much it meant to him. She didn't make a thing of it. She just said, "That's a big deal." And he said, "Yeah, it is." And she ordered Thai food because neither of them had cooked and they ate out of the containers at the island. And she helped him work through the project timeline because project timelines were something she actually knew how to think about. And he let her, which was its own thing, him letting her bring her skills into his world without making it weird. Sylvie turned 9 in March. The party was small, 4 kids from her class and Priya, who had been her best friend since first grade, and arrived with a wrapped gift that turned out to be a field guide to North American insects, which made Sylvie go silent for a full 5 seconds before making a sound that was somewhere between a word and a noise. Grayson's mother was there. Her name was Ruth, and she had the same brown eyes as Grayson and the same economy of expression, and she'd known about Vivian for months. Sylvie talked. and she'd looked at Vivian at the door with a look that was assessment and welcome simultaneously. "Vivienne," she'd said, "I've heard a lot about you." "Sylvie talks," Vivian said. "Sylvie doesn't stop," Ruth said. "Come in." They talked in the kitchen while Grayson managed the chaos of 9-year-olds debating the correct method for pinning streamers. Ruth was not a person who wasted time on approach. She asked Vivian direct questions and got direct answers, and at some point said, "He's better when you're around. I want you to know I see that," in the flat, factual tone that was apparently heritable in the Hale family. Vivian had looked at the birthday chaos in the living room, at Grayson crouched on the floor helping Sylvie open a gift with the focused patience he brought to everything. "I'm better too," she'd said, "when I'm around." Ruth had looked at her. Then she'd turned back to the cake she was slicing and said, "Good." And that had been the end of it, which was also apparently heritable. It was a Thursday night in April, ordinary in every way, when Grayson said it first. They were in his kitchen after dinner. She'd made the soup again, the tomato one from the first night she'd ever cooked for him, which had become a thing without either of them planning it. Sylvie was in bed. The dishes were done. He'd been leaning against the counter, and she'd been at the table with her laptop, half working, half listening to him talk about something from the job site, and in the middle of a sentence, he just stopped. She looked up. "What?" He was looking at her in the specific way she'd learned over months to read. Not the closed, unreadable look, but the open one. The one where he'd already decided something and was just catching up to saying it. "I love you," he said. She looked at him. It wasn't delivered with ceremony. It wasn't framed or softened or built toward. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, because it was true. Because the right time to say something is when you understand it enough to mean it. She set her laptop aside. "Grayson," she said, "you don't have to say anything back right now." "I know I don't." She looked at him. "I love you too. I've been trying to figure out how to say it for 2 months. He almost smiled. 2 months. I kept finding reasons to wait. Timing, the Series D process. I wanted to be sure I was worried I was saying it because things were finally good, and I was confusing gratitude with what? She spread her hands. With the actual thing. And I'm not confused. She said it without hedging. I know the difference. It's you. It's just you. He was quiet for a moment. Then he pushed off the counter and crossed the small kitchen and pulled her up from the chair, and she came up and they were standing there in the middle of the kitchen that she knew as well as her own by now, and he put his hands on either side of her face the way you hold something you don't want to drop, and she thought, this is it. This is what it's supposed to feel like. Not the performance of it, not the idea of it, the real thing, the messy, ordinary, irreplaceable real thing. He kissed her once, carefully, and then again, and she put her hand against his chest where she could feel his heart doing something that told her he was less calm than he looked, which made her love him more. When she stepped back, she was not quite crying, but close. "Don't," he said. "I'm not." She pressed the back of her hand against her eye. "I'm fine." "You're crying." "I'm not. It's..." She exhaled. "I spent so long thinking I was too much of the wrong things and not enough of the right things. Too big, too driven, too focused on work, not soft enough, not flexible enough. I spent years carrying that." She looked at him. "You never made me carry it, not once. Not even the first night when I showed up at your door looking like that." "You look like someone who was having a bad night," he said. "I look like a disaster." "You look like a person." He said it simply. "That's all I saw?" She looked at him for a long moment, then she laughed, a little unsteadily. "I knocked on a stranger's door." "You did?" "That's not something I do." "I know." "I still don't fully understand why I did it." He tilted his head slightly. "Because some part of you knew it was okay to." She thought about that, about the dark hallway, and the rain, and the mascara, and the absolute bottom of that Tuesday night, the lowest she'd felt in a long time, and the door opening onto this man who'd looked at her without pity and without judgment and simply made space. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I think so. The Series D closed in May." $40 million, clean terms, a lead investor who was one of Carla's recommendations. A firm with a track record that Vivian had wanted to work with for 2 years and had finally gotten in front of with numbers that were impossible to argue with. The close came on a Friday afternoon, and she was in her office when Marcus knocked and gave her the confirmation email, and she sat with it for a minute before she called anyone. She called Grayson first. "It closed," she said. "How does it feel?" She looked out the window at the city in May light, warmer now, the trees on the street below having done the thing they do every year that still manages to seem improbable after winter. "Like the beginning of something," she said, "not an ending." "Isn't that what you wanted?" "Yeah." She paused. "Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted." She heard Sylvie's voice in the background asking something, then Grayson, muffled, responding. "What did she say?" Vivian asked. "She wants to know if you're coming for dinner to celebrate." Vivian looked at her calendar, already knowing she'd clear whatever was on it. "Tell her yes." "She says to pick up the good bread." "She knows about the good bread now?" "She's been aware of the good bread for months. She just waits for occasions to deploy it." Vivian laughed. "Tell her I'll get the good bread." She picked up the good bread from the bakery on the way home, and they had dinner. The three of them, just the three of them, at his kitchen table, which was too small for 3 people if any of them had more than one elbow out, which they always did, and Sylvie gave a toast with her glass of apple juice that was unexpectedly eloquent for someone who was 9 and had been briefed on the situation approximately 4 minutes earlier. "To Vivian," Sylvie said, very seriously, "for building her company so good that people want to give her a lot of money. And to my dad for making pasta, even though I think we should have had pizza." She looked at Grayson. "No offense." "Some taken," he said. "And to us," Sylvie added, as if it had just occurred to her, "because I like us." She clinked her juice glass against both of theirs, satisfied with herself, and drank. Vivian set her glass down. She looked at Sylvie, who had already moved on to extracting the maximum possible amount of Parmesan from the jar. She looked at Grayson, who was watching her with the quiet, steady attention that was just who he was. The thing she'd recognized on that first night and had never quite been able to look away from. "Me too, Bug Lady," she said. Sylvie looked up. "What?" "I like us too." Sylvie pointed at her with a fork. "I told you she would get it eventually," she said to Grayson. "She's talking to you," Vivian said. "She talks to everyone, well," Grayson said. "Including the millipede." "Doctors." "Noodle has perspective," Sylvie said, and went back to her pasta. There is a thing that happens in the lives of people who have spent a long time braced against the world, when they finally find somewhere that doesn't require bracing. It doesn't announce itself. There's no single morning where you wake up and think, "I am no longer afraid." It happens gradually, the way your eyes adjust in a dark room. You don't notice the shift until you realize you can see things you couldn't see before. Vivian noticed it in small ways, over the spring and into the summer. She noticed that she went to industry events without the particular armor check she used to do at the door. The internal inventory of whether she was presenting correctly, taking up the right amount of space, managing the room's perception of her before it had a chance to form. She still prepared. She was still precise, but the fear underneath it, the one she'd been managing for so long she'd stopped knowing it was there, had gotten quieter. She noticed that she laughed more. The real laugh, the one that surprised her. It happened around Grayson and Sylvie so often now that she'd stopped tracking it, which was itself the tell. When something becomes normal, you stop counting it. She noticed that she could sit in her own apartment without it feeling like a waiting room. She'd bought a plant. Not as a project or a statement, just because it was at the farmer's market and it was green and she wanted it. And she put it on the windowsill and watered it more or less consistently, and it was alive in July, which she considered a success. Mitchell Crane receded. Not dramatically. There was no confrontation, no clean severance. He simply became less present, which was how these things usually ended when the person they were designed to destabilize stopped being destabilized. She heard his name occasionally in the industry context, the way you hear the name of anyone who runs in overlapping circles. It didn't land the way it once had. He was just a person. Someone she'd had dinner with once who'd said unkind things and then tried to make those unkind things into leverage, and found that leverage only works when the other person is uncertain. She wasn't uncertain anymore about her company, about herself, about the apartment across the hall. Thomas remained on the board and was, after the Thursday call in January, professionally careful in a way that was somewhat more useful than his previous professionally casual. They weren't warm. They didn't need to be warm. They needed to be functional, and they were. Carla came to the Series D closed dinner. A proper dinner, not just the three of them, a real celebration with the team. And she pulled Vivian aside near the end of the evening and said, "You look different." "Different how?" "Like you stopped waiting for the thing that was going to knock you down." Carla tilted her head. "Is that him? The neighbor?" Vivian thought about how to answer that honestly. "He's part of it," she said, "but it's also just, I stopped believing I had to earn the right to be fine." Carla looked at her for a moment. "That took long enough." "Yeah," Vivian said. "It did. The proposal happened in September, on a Saturday evening, on the balcony off Vivian's apartment. She'd had the balcony for 2 years and used it approximately 4 times. It was narrow, and the chairs she'd bought for it were uncomfortable, and the city below was loud in the summer evenings. But in September, the air went different. Something about the angle of the light, and she'd been out there one evening watching the skyline do its dusk thing when Grayson had come out with 2 glasses of wine, one for each of them, because he'd let himself in with the key she'd given him in June, which Sylvie had called very normal and good when she found out. He handed her the wine. They stood at the railing for a while, the city below doing what cities do at that hour. Lights coming on in windows, the particular amber glow of the streetlights beginning their shift, a siren somewhere that rose and passed and faded. She noticed that he was quieter than usual. Grayson was a quiet person generally, but there were different kinds of his quiet. The comfortable, settled kind, and the concentrated kind, the kind where something was turning over in his mind. She recognized this one. "You're thinking about something," she said. "Yeah." She looked at him. "Are you going to tell me, or should I guess?" "Probably tell you." He turned his glass in his hands. "I've been thinking about what we have, what it is, where it's going." He looked at her. "I'm not a person who talks around things very well." "I know. That's one of the things I like about you. So I'll just say it." He set his glass down on the narrow railing ledge. Then he reached into the pocket of his jacket. He'd worn the jacket, which she noted in retrospect she should have noticed. He didn't usually wear it on casual Saturdays, and he held something between his fingers. A ring. Simple. A pale gold band with a small stone that caught the September light. She looked at it, then at him. "I'm not doing a speech," he said. "I don't have a speech. I've got—" He exhaled. "I've got the fact that the last year has been the most alive I've felt in a long time. That you walked into my apartment in November and sat at my table, and I knew before you finished your tea that something had changed. That Sylvie fell asleep on your shoulder and you looked at her like she was yours, and she was. Because she decided you were hers a long time before any of us said anything about it." He looked at her directly, the steady brown gaze that she'd trusted since the first night. "I want to build what we already have, but actually, officially. I want you across the hall to mean something permanent. I want Sylvie to be able to say your name and have it be the right word for what you are." He paused. "Marry me. Not will you marry me. Just marry me." A statement and a question and a request all at once, delivered in his voice, which was plain and quiet and always meant exactly what it said. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. The city was doing its September evening thing all around them, indifferent and luminous. There were things she could have said. She had, in her life, given speeches in boardrooms and delivered pitches to rooms full of skeptical investors and stood in front of a hostile question and answered it without flinching. She had language for most things. What came out was, yes, obviously, yes. He laughed, a real one, unexpected, the kind she'd made him make. He put the ring on her finger and it fit, which he admitted he'd gotten by asking Sylvie, who had somehow obtained the information through means neither of them investigated too closely. She held her hand out and looked at it in the amber September light, and then looked at him, and something in her chest did a thing she didn't have a name for. Not just happiness, which was too simple, but the feeling of arriving somewhere after a long way. the feeling of a journey whose length you only understand once you've stopped moving. Did Sylvie know? She asked. I asked her permission first, he said. She stared at him. You asked a 9-year-old for permission to propose to me? She's very mature for her age. Grayson? She said, and I'm quoting directly, obviously, yes, Dad, we've been waiting. He held her gaze. The we was her choice of word. Vivian pressed her lips together very hard. Her eyes were full. I'm not crying, she said. You're absolutely crying. I'm not. She wiped her eye with the back of her hand. She exhaled a shaky breath. I knocked on your door in November because I couldn't stand to be alone for one more hour, and I thought maybe a stranger would be better than nothing. I had no idea. I know. I had no idea I was knocking on. She gestured between them, the gesture encompassing him and the ring and the apartment and the whole accumulated year. I know, he said again. He pulled her in and she let him, and she put her forehead against his shoulder and stood there for a moment with the ring on her finger and the city below and the September evening doing its gentle thing around them. There is a version of this story where someone who looks like Vivian Sterling doesn't get this, where the years of comments and assessments and the man at the dinner table who said she should be grateful add up to a belief, deep and mostly unconscious, that the full version of a life, the love and the family and the someone who looks at you first thing in the morning and stays, isn't actually available to her. Where she takes the smaller thing, the almost thing, and calls it enough. There's also a version where someone like Grayson Hale keeps his apartment very tidy and his heart very managed and his life very stable and calls the stability happiness and builds walls around Sylvie's well-being so thorough that he forgets to leave a door open for himself. Both of those versions are the easier ones, statistically. They require less risk. They confirm what you already believe about what's possible. This version required a rainy Tuesday and a breaking point and a woman willing to knock on a door she had no reason to knock on. It required a man willing to open it without conditions. That's the part that gets missed in stories like this one. People look at the ending, the ring, the balcony, the city lights, and they see the reward. What they don't see is all the smaller decisions that made it. The decision to go inside when invited, not out of politeness but out of genuine need. The decision to listen without fixing. The decision to show up with coffee on a Saturday, not because it was owed, but because you wanted to. The decision to tell the truth in a hallway when the neat version would have been so much easier. Those decisions didn't look like courage when they were happening. They looked like just barely getting through the moment. But that's what courage mostly looks like. Not the big gesture, the small one, made over and over in the ordinary light of an ordinary day. They told Sylvie that night. She was at Ruth's, which was where she always was on Saturday evenings, when Grayson wanted uninterrupted time, and Vivienne called her from the balcony because Sylvie had specifically asked to be called the second it happened, with a confidence that suggested she'd had very little doubt about the outcome. Sylvie answered on the second ring. Well? She said, by way of hello. Vivian laughed. Yes, she said. There was a sound on the other end that was Sylvie, 9 years old, expressing pure, uncurated joy in the way that only 9-year-olds can, loud and complete, and entirely without self-consciousness. Vivian held the phone away from her ear for a second, and Grayson, beside her, could hear it clearly, and he looked at the phone and then at Vivian, and something in his face went soft in the way it only went when it was about his daughter. Can I tell Grandma? Sylvie demanded. Yes, Vivian said. Another sound, distant, Ruth being told. Then Ruth's voice clearly. Well, it's about time. Vivian looked at Grayson. Your mother, she said. Yeah, he agreed. She's been waiting. For how long? She told me in February that if I didn't do something about it soon, she was going to do it herself. I don't know what that means, but I wasn't interested in finding out. Vivian put her head back and laughed at the September sky. Sylvie came back on the line. Vivienne, she said in a more serious voice. Yeah? I already know what I want to call you. I've been deciding. Vivian was quiet for a second. What did you decide? I want to just call you Vivian, Sylvie said. Because that's who you are, Vivian, not a different name. Just you. She paused. Is that okay? Vivian pressed her hand to her mouth, looked at the city for a second. That's perfect, she said. Okay. Satisfied the way Sylvie was always satisfied when logic confirmed a position she'd already held. I'm going to go tell Grandma the part about the ring. Bye. The call ended. Vivian lowered the phone. She's going to be okay, Grayson said quietly. Not a question. She's already okay, Vivian said. She's been okay. She figured this out before either of us did. He looked at the skyline. She usually does. They stood on the narrow balcony in the September air, the city spread below them in all its ordinary enormity. The lights of other apartments were coming on across the buildings. Other people, other lives, other kitchens where someone was making dinner, and other hallways where someone was about to knock on a door and not know yet what would answer. Vivian looked at her hand. The ring caught the light the way things do when they're new, obvious, insistent. She thought it would feel strange. It felt entirely natural, which was itself the tell. There's a thing people say about relationships, that you know when it's right because it feels easy. That's not exactly true. Nothing worth having is entirely easy. What it actually feels like, the real thing, the right thing, is not easy, but safe. It feels like being handed something valuable and knowing, without being told, that you're not going to drop it, that the person handing it to you already knows you can hold it. That's what Grayson had given her. Not ease, not perfection. A plain, honest conviction that she could be exactly who she was, all of it. The ambition, and the insecurity, and the precise intelligence, and the woman who cried in hallways sometimes. And that none of it was going to be too much. She'd spent years believing she needed to be smaller to be loved. The truth, which she understood now, was almost embarrassingly simple. She just needed to find the person for whom her full size was exactly right. He was standing beside her. He'd been standing beside her, in one way or another, since November, since the kettle and the tea and the plain statement that she didn't have to hold it together here. The city went on below them. The September light faded into the early dark. Come inside, he said. Yeah, she said. She followed him in,